I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. There she was, my daughter-in-law, standing on my porch with 2 suitcases at her feet and my son hovering behind her like he always did. Slightly hunched, hands in his pockets, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. I hadn't seen either of them in 4 years. 4 years, 2 months, and about 11 days if I'm being precise. And I am being precise, because when someone cuts you out of their life, you remember exactly when it happened. I stood there for a moment, not moving, just breathing. The porch light cast a yellow glow across her face, and she looked exactly the same. Same tight smile, same sharp eyes, scanning everything like she was already calculating what things were worth. I'd bought this lake house 8 months ago. I'd saved for 12 years. 12 years of substitute teaching after my husband passed, of not taking vacations, of driving a car that needed a new muffler for 2 full winters because I kept telling myself, not yet. And when I finally had enough, I found this little cabin on Lake Hartwell in South Carolina. Cedar siding, a wraparound porch, a dock where you could sit in the morning and watch the herons come in low over the water. I had not told my son about it. I had not told anyone in that part of my family. So the first thing I thought, looking through that peephole, was, how do they know? My son's name is Owen. He's 41 years old, and he has his father's eyes and his father's laugh and almost none of his father's character. I say that with grief, not cruelty. I spent 20 years watching the man I raised become someone I didn't fully recognize, and I know exactly when it happened, the year he married Noelle. Noelle is not a bad person the way villains in movies are bad. She doesn't twirl anything. She's perfectly pleasant in short doses. What she is relentless. She knows exactly what she wants, and she is extraordinarily patient about positioning herself to get it. She told Owen, early in their marriage, that I was too involved, that I called too often, that my visits made her feel like a guest in her own home. Owen repeated this to me almost word for word one Sunday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table, and I remember thinking, he's been coached on this. Every phrase was too smooth, too prepared. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I backed off the calls. I stopped dropping by without asking 3 days in advance. I sent birthday cards instead of showing up. I did every small retreat she seemed to want. And every time I retreated, she moved the line a little further back. The last time I saw them before the silence was Thanksgiving. 4 years ago. Noelle had made it clear I should come for dinner and leave by 8. I came at 2. I left at 7:53. On the drive home, I passed a Waffle House and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes because I wasn't ready to walk into my empty house yet. 2 weeks later, Owen called and told me they needed space. That I had said something at Thanksgiving that made Noelle uncomfortable. I asked what. He said he'd rather not get into it. I asked again. He said, "Mom, please." I didn't hear from them for 4 years. Here is what I did during those 4 years. I grieved. Not dramatically. I'm not that kind of woman. But quietly and thoroughly. I grieved the version of my son I'd hoped for. I went to therapy for 14 months and said out loud things I'd never said to another human being. I got good at sleeping alone in a house that used to feel too quiet. I made friends. Real ones, the kind you make in your 60s when you're no longer performing anything for anyone. My neighbor Wanda and I started taking water aerobics on Tuesday mornings. My friend from church, Roberta, and I drive to Asheville twice a year to walk around and eat things we can't find at home. And I bought the lake house. That lake house was mine. Every splinter of it. I'd paid cash because I didn't want a mortgage at 63. I'd spent 3 weekends painting the interior myself, a pale gray blue that made the rooms feel like the inside of a seashell. I planted a garden along the south-facing side. I hung my mother's mirror in the hallway. I had built something that was entirely, unambiguously mine. So when I saw Noelle standing on that porch with her luggage, I felt something go very cold and very still inside me, like a door locking. I opened it anyway. "Mom." Owen stepped forward first, and something in his voice was off, strained. He looked thinner than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Owen. I looked at him, then at Noelle, then at the suitcases. What is this? Noelle smiled. The smile she always used when she was about to say something that should have been a question but wasn't. We've been going through a really hard time, she said. Owen lost his job 3 months ago, and our lease ended, and we needed somewhere to land for a little while. Just until we get back on our feet. I looked at my son. You lost your job? He looked at the porch railing. Yeah, it's been rough. Why didn't you call me? He didn't answer that. How do you even know about this house? I asked. I never told you. Noelle's smile didn't waver. Owen's cousin mentioned it. Small world. She bent and picked up one of the suitcases. Just picked it up, like the conversation was over, like my front door was simply a threshold she was about to cross. We really appreciate this. We won't be any trouble. I put my hand on the door frame. I didn't say you could come in. The look on her face in that moment. I won't pretend I didn't feel something. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the feeling of finally saying out loud a thing you've been practicing in your head for years. Owen looked up from the porch railing. Mom? No, Owen, I love you. I do. But you disappeared from my life for 4 years. You didn't call me when you lost your job. You didn't call me when your lease ended. You didn't call me when your lease ended. You didn't call me at any point in this situation to ask how I was, or to explain, or to apologize. And now you're standing on my porch with luggage, expecting to move in. We didn't know where else to go, Noelle said. Her voice had shifted. Still controlled, but underneath it, something tightening. Then that's a consequence of the choices you made, I said. Not something I'm responsible for fixing. Owen ran a hand through his hair. He looked honestly like he might cry, and that nearly broke me. My son. My boy who used to fall asleep in the car and I'd carry him inside and he'd barely wake up, just sort of settle into my shoulder. That boy was somewhere inside this 41-year-old man on my porch, and it hurt in a way I don't have the words for. But hurt and obligation are not the same thing. It took me 14 months of therapy to really understand that. I need you to take your bags, I said quietly. You're welcome to sit on the porch and talk with me. I'll make coffee. But you are not moving in. Not today, not without a conversation. Not like this. We sat on the porch for 3 hours. I made coffee and brought out the good cups, the ones with the blue rim I'd found at an estate sale in Seneca. Noelle sat with her hands wrapped around hers and didn't say much for the first 30 minutes. Owen talked. He talked more than I'd heard him talk in years. About the job, a management consulting firm that had done a round of layoffs in February. About the apartment lease that had ended the same month. About the 4 months they'd spent in a friend's guest room before that fell through too. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I'd learned somewhere in those 14 months of therapy that listening isn't the same as agreeing. Why didn't you call me? I asked again when he'd gotten quiet. He looked at his hands. Noelle thought we thought. He stopped. Tried again. I was embarrassed. And I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. Owen. I set down my cup. I am your mother. I have wanted to hear from you every single day for 4 years. Not hearing from you has been one of the hardest things I've lived through, and I've lived through losing your father. Don't mistake my not chasing you for not caring. He looked up then, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked exactly like the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and present them with both hands like they were roses. Noelle was quiet. I glanced at her, and she was looking at her coffee cup, and something in her posture was different from an hour ago, less managed. I want to be honest about something because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I was not a perfect mother-in-law. I am almost certain of that. I probably called too often in those early years. I probably had opinions I shared when they weren't asked for. I showed up once, without texting first, because I'd been nearby and had homemade soup, and Owen had mentioned he'd had a cold. In retrospect, I can see how that might have felt like a violation of a newlywed's space. I can see that. But there is a difference between needing to establish new boundaries with a mother-in-law and systematically dismantling her relationship with her son until she has no place in his life at all. One of those things is reasonable. The other is something else. I said that on the porch. Not the way I just wrote it. I wasn't that composed. But I said something close to it. And Noelle didn't argue. She said, "I think I made it harder than it needed to be." That was all. Just that. Not an apology exactly, but the closest thing to one I'd ever heard from her. And it was enough, not to fix everything, but enough to keep the door from closing permanently. Owen asked again, near the end of that third hour, if they could stay. I said no. Not because I didn't want to help him. I did, desperately. But because I'd learned something in those 4 years of quiet that I hadn't known before. The way you let people back into your life matters. If I let them move in that night, no conversation, no accountability, nothing but Noelle picking up a suitcase and walking through my door like the previous 4 years had been a minor inconvenience, then I would be starting over at the same place we'd always been. Me accommodating, them expanding into every space I left. I am 63 years old. I have maybe 25 or 30 good years left if I'm fortunate. I am not spending them being someone's soft place to land while they treat me like furniture. I told Owen I would help them find a furnished rental nearby. I told him I would loan him money for the first 2 months while he got back on his feet. As a loan, with a written agreement, not as a gift that could be forgotten. I told him I wanted to have dinner once a week, just the two of us to start, and that I wanted to rebuild what we'd lost before we added anyone else to the equation. He started crying then. Just quietly, no drama. He put his face in his hands and cried the way men do when they've been holding something for too long. I moved my chair closer and put my hand on his back. His shoulder blades felt sharp under my palm, like he'd lost weight. I didn't say anything. I just left my hand there. Noelle was looking out at the lake. They found an apartment in Hartwell, about 12 minutes from the lake house. Owen got a job 6 weeks later. Not in consulting, in operations management for a distribution company. Less prestigious, but steadier. He told me about it over dinner, and he seemed relieved in a way that consulting had never made him seem. We've had dinner every Thursday for 7 months now. Just the two of us. The way I asked. Sometimes we cook at the lake house. Sometimes we go to a little Italian place in town that makes their own pasta. We talk about his father a lot. We talk about his father a lot. We talk about things we should have said years ago. It's slow and sometimes awkward, and once I cried in a restaurant, which I was not pleased about, but it is real. Noelle and I are not close. I want to be honest about that too. We are polite. We are careful with each other. She came to the lake house for the first time 3 months ago, and I watched her look around at the rooms I'd painted, the garden I'd planted, and I thought, she understands now that this is mine. Not something to be moved into. Not somewhere she can set her suitcase down and rearrange the furniture. She complimented the mirror in the hallway, my mother's mirror. "Thank you," I said. It was my mother's. And we left it at that. There is something I want to say to anyone listening who has been in a situation like mine, because I know I'm not the only one. I know this because of what I've lived and because of who I've talked to, women my age who has been slowly edited out of their children's lives and who have spent years wondering what they did wrong, what they could have done differently, whether the distance was their fault. Here is what I know. You can love someone and still refuse to be treated like your feelings don't matter. Those two things are not in conflict. In fact, and this took me a long time to understand, refusing to be treated poorly is sometimes the most loving thing you can do because it forces the relationship to exist on honest terms, instead of terms where one person is always shrinking to keep the peace. I did not reclaim my son by giving him what he showed up asking for. I reclaimed him by making it clear what I required and then holding that line quietly, without cruelty, until he was ready to meet me there. The lake is beautiful in the early morning. The herons still come in low over the water. I drink my coffee on the dock, and most mornings I have that hour entirely to myself, and I am genuinely at peace with my life in a way I was not 4 years ago. Owen called last week, no reason, just to talk. He called on a Tuesday, which isn't our Thursday. I picked up on the second ring. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd just stepped aside that evening and let Noelle carry her suitcase through my door. I know exactly what would have happened. I've lived that version of the story before, just in smaller installments, over 20 years. I would have told myself it was temporary, I would have made up the guest room and kept my opinions quiet and rearranged my own routines around their comfort, the way I always had. And within 6 months, I would have been a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around the kitchen I'd painted myself, in the house I'd spent 12 years saving for. That's not cruelty talking. That's just pattern recognition. When you've watched something play out long enough, you stop being surprised by where it ends. What I've come to understand, and I mean really understand, not just the version of it you say out loud, is that how you let people back into your life matters as much as whether you let them back in. I could have loved Owen and still lost myself in the process of helping him. The two things are not automatically in conflict, but they can be, if you're not paying attention. And for most of my life, I was not paying attention. There is something that happens to women my age, I think. We are trained from a very young age to measure our value by how much we can absorb, how much we can give without being asked, how much we can endure without complaint, how much space we can clear for everyone else, while quietly making ourselves smaller. And we're so practiced at it by the time we're 60 that we don't even notice when we're doing it anymore. It just feels like love. But love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's a performance of love. And the people who benefit from that performance, not all of them, but some of them, they know the difference even if you don't. Owen didn't come back to the porch that night ready to be honest. He came back because he had run out of other options. That's a hard thing to say about your own child, and I say it without bitterness, because I think it was also the beginning of something real. Sometimes people only reach for honesty when they've exhausted everything easier. That's human. I've done it myself. What I know is this: the moment I put my hand on that door frame, something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a movie, but something settled into place in me that had been loose for a long time. I had spent 4 years learning how to want things for myself. The lake house, the Tuesday mornings with Wanda, the quiet hour on the dock. And I was not willing to hand all of that over simply because someone I loved arrived in need. Holding that line was the most loving thing I ever did for Owen, because it told him, without a speech, that our relationship was going to have to be built on something honest or not at all. And he rose to that. Slowly, imperfectly, the way people do. Consequences are not punishment. They're just the shape that choices make over time. Noelle spent years making my world smaller, and then found herself with nowhere to stand. Owen spent years choosing silence, and then found that silence had costs. And I spent years making myself smaller, and then finally stopped, and found that the space I'd been holding open for everyone else had always been mine to keep. I pick up on the second ring now. Every time,